Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Please excuse my absence this past week. It's been a busy week in my household, and in my own study, too. More on that soon, but today I want to answer the Hindsight is 2020 tag. Just a wonderful set of questions about how we started our reading lives. The tag was created by Aaron at Aaron Go Reads, and I was thrilled to be tagged by Roz as scallywandling about the books. Roz's version is lovely and made me think a lot about how different our reading was when we were young. Although we were children at roughly the same time period, the books young children read in England and in the United States were pretty different, perhaps more different than the books older children and adults read, or even studied in school. I also have really enjoyed several other versions of this tag, especially those by women, including Doris at Alta Books, Kathy at The Grim Reader, and Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading. Yes, I've always been aware that I tend to have more overlap, even in my adult reading choices, with other women readers than I do with many of my male reading friends. But I don't think the differences are nearly as significant as they were between books read by girls and boys when we were growing up in previous decades. I hope that's less true now for today's young people. I know the books my son read as a child were far less obviously girl books or boy books than the books that filled my early shelves. Although, of course, even then, some of the best books for young people have always had a very wide appeal to both boys and to girls, and to readers across the globe. Roz mentions in the description box that many of us have talked about our early reading lives before, sometimes in great depth. For a somewhat sentimental booktuber who loves to tell stories, that's certainly true for me. If you hang around here a lot, you've probably heard me talk about some of these same kinds of issues before. But today, I'll try to mention a few stories I haven't shared before. The first prompt asks, what were you like as an early and learning reader? I read quite early and I loved to read. For my first 7+ years, I was an only child with 2 readers for parents and no big presence of television in my life. One of my early memories is of sitting on the wood floor in our hallway, picking picture books off the hall shelf and getting buried in a beautifully illustrated edition of the fairy tales Snow White and Red Rose, or in the stories of Peter Rabbit and Miss Tiggywinkle and Jemima Puddle Duck, and occasionally glancing up to see my reading self reflected in the full-length mirror attached to the door at the end of the hall. Although I definitely spent a lot of time reading alone, my neighborhood was full of young people, and we spent a lot of time outdoors playing, including playing out storylines from our favorite books. I was often Mary from Little House on the Prairie, and sometimes Marilla from Anne of Green Gables. Sometimes we played detectives, based on some accretion of Nancy Drew and the Bobbsey twins and Sherlock Holmes retellings. Interestingly, by 5th grade or so, I was often cast in our changing imaginative play as Trapper John, and very occasionally as Hot Lips Houlihan, as my young friends started acting out MASH. Although all my friends seemed to know the stories, I did not. My parents told me that the novel was aimed at older readers, which I sort of gathered since there was a character named Hot Lips. I don't know how long it took me until I realized that we were acting out not a book, but a television show. The way we played never required people to know in advance the actual storylines or even the real characters. None of this kind of play was actual reading, I guess, but our interest in creating character and creating plot made us engage in a collective experience of almost exactly what I felt when I was immersed in a book. The second question, what book or book series really got you excited about reading as a kid? I've talked many times about how Louisa May Alcott's Little Women was so important to me, and just mentioned some other early favorites from Nancy Drew to Anne of Green Gables. I think I want to mention a series of books I did not read when I was growing up, but found in the local library immediately after my son was born. Roz mentioned these books in her version of this tag too. Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazons. I only read one when my son was tiny, but immediately knew we would be coming back to them when he was old enough to understand them. What wonderful books. I suspect if they were written today, there's some portrayals of gender and the like that would be a little different. But fundamentally, these books are about boys and girls having adventures together with family and with new friends. The adventures are half real, camping out all summer on an island without their parents, for example, and half imagination about stories straight from a world of adventure novels, pirates, or whatever. What I love best is that while the children in the stories sometimes squabble with each other, they're eager to support each other too. For example, in a competition that plays a big role in one of the books, the teams work hard against each other. But as soon as one side wins, all the characters are cheering and celebrating together. If you didn't read these as a young person, read them now. I bring these books up partly because it relates to something I said earlier about how books were at the heart of how my neighborhood friends and I played together. My son Abe did the same, and the storylines he introduced both to his close friends and to kids he met randomly on a playground were often from Swallows and Amazons. The other children didn't know these books, but they quickly were drawn into their own versions of the adventures. One day, when I had walked with my son to a local park to sit on a bench knitting while watching him climb on a pirate boat-shaped jungle gym, a family I'd never met arrived at just about the same time. The mother nodded, pulled out the sock she was knitting, and sat down to chat. Her daughter, a few months older than Abe, joined him on the pirate ship, and they immediately broke into a highly detailed and very specific account of the stories of John and Nancy and the other children from Swallows and Amazons. The mother and I stared at each other. "Y'all know these books?" We all became friends, and the kids played together on the playground and at each other's houses for years, and then played together in a violin studio for years after that. Question 3. Has there been a person in your life, real or fictional, who inspired you to be a reader? Both my mother and my father were huge influences on my reading life. But since I talk about them both quite frequently, I'll mention a school librarian instead. At the beginning of second grade, I think, my class all took a reading test to decide what our reading level was. There was a huge box of SRA color-coded pamphlets or booklets, each with a reading passage or story, and then a series of vocabulary drills and reading comprehension exercises. Because I was a huge reader beforehand, I passed out of the series, and my friend Doug was placed near the very end of the box, so he finished within a couple of weeks. The two of us were sent to the school library when the rest of the class were working through the SRA box. Looking back, I'm not sure why we weren't just allowed to do free reading, since both of us were the kinds of kids who always had a book in our book bag. Perhaps the teachers thought that other students would feel that was unfair. Anyway, we were sent to Miss Ludlow, the school librarian. She taught us how the Dewey Decimal System worked and how to shelve books that various classes had returned. She showed us how she repaired damaged books and how she put little black tags with burned-in call numbers on new books ready to be shelved. And she showed us this cool new machine she had acquired that would help people learn how to speed read. Doug and I loved to play with it, and I know I had flashbacks when I was in college and grad school. Having my head in a microfilm reader was similar enough to my memory of the speed reading machine that right in the middle of the archives, I relived some favorite childhood moments. I don't know if Miss Ludlow actually inspired me as a reader, but she definitely expanded my bookish life in some fairly extraordinary ways for a second grader. Just having what felt like a friendship with a reading adult who wasn't a relative was a pretty special thing. The fourth prompt. At what point did you begin to identify as a reader? I don't remember a time when I didn't identify as a reader. Two of the times when it was most obvious to me were when I couldn't really read for a while, following brain surgery when I was 25, and then during chemotherapy treatment for breast cancer a few years ago. As I'm sure you all understand, reading has often given me a way to deal with hard times by considering how others deal with similar situations. And books have often given me a source of distraction, too. Not being able to turn to books at moments when I needed them most made it clear to me how much those words on a page mean to me. Okay, the last substantive prompt. How has being a reader shaped your life and your worldview? Several of you have talked about how being a reader helped you become a more empathetic person, maybe being able to imagine yourself standing in someone else's shoes, even in just a small way. Books can expand our worldviews and our minds in so many ways, and Brian at Bookish has an especially beautiful answer along those lines. I'll add that I think reading can help us understand not just the different perspectives and experiences of other people, but also help us predict the responses and understand the motivations of the people around us, or rather understand a wide range of their possible motivations. Of course, reading is very much not a foolproof way to develop these skills, something I personally have been reminded of this week. And of course, it isn't the only way to develop these skills either. But listening to other people talk about their lives and tell their stories about themselves and their loved ones, and hear them explain their personal philosophy, is a skill that readers definitely practice. Well, the last thing to do is to tag someone whose reading history you want to learn more about. I'll tag two booktubers today. Mel at Mel's Bookland Adventures, who I'm thrilled has returned to BookTube recently, and Bear at Bear Reads Books, who I saw just this morning has also returned. I also want to tag some of the regular commenters here. From what you've shared so far, many of you seem to have interesting stories about books and people and situations that turned you into readers. Please feel free to answer below or on some other platform if you prefer, and let me know. I'd love to hear more about how you were drawn into this bookish world. Thanks for creating this lovely tag, Erin, and for tagging me, Roz. And thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.